So, what I'd like to do with the next 10 minutes is to help us all rethink the monolingual mindset that we bring to a particular issue in Australia of education in remote Indigenous communities. And what do I mean by a monolingual mindset? Well, these are the kinds of things that we hear politicians saying, that we see reported in the media, where we see these kinds of statements that Indigenous children need to speak English and only English, and that Indigenous languages are actually a barrier to learning English. So in order to start exploring this idea of our monolingual mindset, which is quite invisible for many of us, I'd like to introduce you to a couple of people. This is Melissa and this is Tom. And these are a teacher and student pair who live in a community that I've worked in as a linguist for the last 14 years. So the community is located in the Northern Territory in a very remote location on the traditional lands of Gurindji people, and it's called Gurindji. So Melissa and Tom bring very different things to the classroom. They bring different linguistic repertoires and linguistic resources. And we need to think about what it is that they're bringing to the classroom in order to rethink how the education setting works. So if we have a look at Tom first of all, Tom is typical of most Aboriginal children in remote communities in that he doesn't have English as the language that he learnt from birth. Instead, Tom has an Indigenous language as his first language, the language he learnt from his parents and from his grandparents. And there's some really obvious things we can say about this traditional language with respect to English. Obviously, it has different words. It also has a very different sound system, and we'll see how this sort of plays out shortly. It also has a very, very different grammar from English, which makes some difficulties with that transition, and encoded in that grammar is a very different worldview. The other thing that Tom brings to this education setting is having a multilingual mindset. And this is a mindset that he brings from his community of multilingual people who find it very normal to add new languages like English, for instance, to their linguistic repertoire. So he comes to the classroom with a very open mind about learning a new language. Let's look at Melissa now. Melissa's also fairly typical of most teachers in remote communities. So she doesn't come from the community herself. She comes from outside of the community, and she has English as her first language. It was the language she grew up with in her family. She also, of course, has a degree in primary education, otherwise she wouldn't be there. And with that degree in primary education, she brings an awful lot of skills and knowledge. But there are some things missing from this education degree. First of all, most teachers who enter remote communities don't have a background in teaching students from an English as a second language background, an ESL background, students like Tom. They also don't tend to have an awareness of the children's Indigenous language background. Many teachers enter communities not realising that children don't actually speak English in the home. And not only that, but the teachers don't have access to resources to try and bridge this gap. So for instance, if we go overseas, we usually go armed with some kind of phrase book, or these days some kind of mobile phone app, and it gives us just a bit of a shoe into another language and another culture so that we can operate in those places. We don't have access to these kinds of resources when we go to Indigenous communities. Teachers don't have these kinds of resources. So Tom and Melissa bring very different linguistic skills and background to this setting, this education setting. And because of these different skills and backgrounds, there's a number of kinds of ramifications. And we can have a look at a couple of these. So if we think first of all in a really, really micro level, just about sounds. So in a particular setting like this, a teacher might be playing with a set of cards with Tom, for instance, and might give an instruction which she considers to be really simple and says something like, "Tom, show me the picture of the peach." Now for Tom, he has to go from the sound system of his first language, Gurindji, and match that to the sound system of English. And the difficulty in this particular setting is that Tom doesn't have a distinction between P and B in his language. And you can think of this as when you go overseas and you start learning a new language, you've got an accent. And it's the same when Tom learns English. He's got an accent, and it's because his sound system is very different from English. And this is the case with many Indigenous languages. So for Tom, he hears the word peach, and he looks at two cards before him, one of beach and one of a peach, and he's not quite sure what the teacher wants. So something that's a really simple instruction is actually something that requires a stepped learning process for Tom. If we now go from sounds to a much sort of broader conceptual level, we can see some interesting problems that we would never have considered. So again, Melissa might say something that seems like a really simple instruction to her, something like, Tom, put the card to the left of the other card. Now you're thinking, I'm going to tell you Tom has difficulties with this. Yeah, well, lots of us had difficulties with left and right. In primary school, I was one of those kids who had left and right written on my ballet shoes because I couldn't figure it out. So of course, lots of kids have trouble with left and right, but Tom has an extra layer of difficulty when it comes to left and right. The community that he grew up in actually doesn't have words for left and right in the language. Instead, what they do is they talk about objects in relation to other objects in terms of north, south, east and west. So if Tom were performing this same exercise with one of his parents or one of his grandparents, they'd be saying something to him like, Tom, put the picture to the north of the other picture, even in this very, very small space on the carpet here. And this has a number of implications. First of all, Tom constantly has this amazing activated mental map of the world. He's, like many Aboriginal children, is very good at direction finding, can point to towns a long way away that he's rarely visited and tell you exactly where they are. And it's a real shame this sort of stuff isn't tested on NAPLAN tests. However, when he comes to the education setting, having this direction system is a difficulty. And the difficulty is that our literacy practices are so imbued with this idea of left and right that a student like Tom needs to be taught them. So for instance, many of you have probably never thought that in order to progress a narrative, we turn pages from right to left. That's something that we've probably never been taught explicitly. And there's lots of other places where left and right is really important in education, in literacy practices particularly. For instance, the left-right orientation of a letter might give you a B or it might give you a D. So these are all things, of course, that any child, even Tom, can learn, but he needs to be stepped through the process because we all know how hard it is to learn another language. We need to have stepped instructions. So what can we do about this? Well, there are many very good bilingual education models in the world and indeed in Australia. In fact, there have been many wonderful bilingual schools in Australia that transition children from 3 years being taught in their first language to transitioning into English. But of course, the same stories of funding and this monolingual mindset that we bring to education have slowly derailed a lot of these schools. This is at a policy level. We can also provide teachers with much better language resources and support. So this is the phrase book that we all go armed with when we go to another country. Teachers need that, or a mobile phone app. Teachers also need to have, and as you can see slowly being revealed here, co-teachers from the communities. Teachers themselves who've been through the education system and speak English, who can act as the bridge between the child's world and the teacher's world to help them step towards English, but also to maintain their strength in their own language. All of these things are not original, and they're also at a really large level. And many of us have different kinds of backgrounds, but many of you are probably thinking, well, I can't influence policy. I can't make a mobile phone app. There is one thing, though, that we can all do, and this is to change our monolingual mindset. So when we're listening to politicians talking on TV, when we're hearing reports in the media, and we see statements like these, we can change the reactions that we have to these statements. So for instance, a statement that you often hear in the media, that Indigenous children need to learn to speak English. Our first reaction to that is probably, well, yeah, of course, they need it to be able to function in mainstream society. But what's behind that statement? What's behind that statement is some kind of idea that communities don't want their kids to learn English. The last 14 years that I've been working in this particular part of the world in the Northern Territory, I've never heard an Indigenous parent say that they don't want their kids to learn English, that they don't want their kids to add English to their already rich multilingual repertoire. But what they don't want is also to add English at the expense of their traditional languages, because these traditional languages are very important for their connection to land and their identity. So when you hear people saying things like Indigenous children need to learn English, well, sure, of course. But it doesn't mean that this can't be added to something, not that children need to learn English instead of their own languages. So the other thing that we then hear from this is that these Indigenous languages are actually a barrier to learning English. And as we all know, when we're learning a second language, we take a lot of what we know from our first language to that setting, and we make mistakes because of it. We get the grammar wrong, we get the sounds wrong, we have an accent. So there are difficulties in moving from one language to another, but these languages aren't barriers. They're not barriers to learning English. In fact, we find that when Indigenous languages are learnt in the classrooms, you have higher school attendance and you have much higher parental participation in the school and in the classroom. And not only that, but what we find is that students who learn mathematical and science concepts, things that are much more conceptual level in their first language, transition much better through the classroom situation. So what I'd all like you to do is to go home from today knowing that it is most likely the case that you do have a monolingual mindset and that we do value English in our country over other languages. And I'd like you to try and reset that monolingual mindset into a kind of multilingual mindset. And to do that, I'll leave you with this wonderful map of Indigenous Australia and of all of the wonderful languages that are spoken in the country to try and step towards some kind of multilingual mindset.